A lie in the courtroom, the storm begins. The air inside the packed courtroom was thick with tension, the weight of anticipation pressing down on every person in attendance. Spectators sat in hushed expectation, reporters gripping their notepads, a few concerned faces whispering among themselves. A case like this didn't come around often. It wasn't every day that a decorated police officer accused a civilian of attacking him, and certainly not when that civilian was a black woman standing at the defendant's table, accused of assaulting a police officer. At the prosecution's table, Officer Ryan Walker sat upright in his neatly pressed uniform, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. His expression was composed, confident, almost smug. Beside him, District Attorney David Sinclair, a veteran prosecutor with an unshakable reputation, adjusted his tie and prepared to speak. This was supposed to be an open and shut case. The defendant, Angela Carter, however, remained unreadable. She sat motionless in her seat, her dark brown skin illuminated by the courtroom lights, her braided hair falling neatly over her shoulder. Her face was calm. Too calm. While most people in her position would be fidgeting, sweating under the pressure of an entire courtroom judging them, Angela was as still as a statue. She didn't speak. She barely moved. This unnerved Walker more than he cared to admit. "All rise," the bailiff commanded. The courtroom shuffled to its feet as Judge Richard Henderson entered, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with piercing gray eyes and the air of someone who had long since run out of patience for legal theatrics. As he settled into his seat, the room followed. "State of New York vs. Angela Carter," the bailiff announced. The trial was underway. Sinclair wasted no time, rising smoothly to deliver his opening statement. His voice carried the authority of years spent in courtrooms, convincing juries to convict. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his hands clasped before him, "this is a case about a simple request met with unnecessary violence. The prosecution will show that Officer Walker, in the course of his lawful duty, attempted to de-escalate a situation with the defendant, Angela Carter. And yet, rather than comply with a reasonable order, she chose to resist arrest. Not only that, she attacked a police officer. A trained officer, whose only goal was to ensure public safety. This case is not about race, or politics, or personal bias. It is about a clear, undeniable act of aggression against law enforcement." Angela remained silent, watching. Sinclair gestured toward Walker, who sat up straighter, his expression carefully measured. "Officer Walker has served this city for over a decade. He has been a dedicated public servant, risking his life for our protection. What he experienced that night was unacceptable." He turned to the jury. "The evidence will show that this officer was forced to defend himself against a violent, hostile suspect. And that suspect is sitting before you today." Angela's lawyer, Daniel Brooks, leaned in and whispered, "Breathe, Angela." She hadn't realized she was holding her breath. "Thank you," Sinclair concluded, returning to his seat. Judge Henderson looked to Brooks. "Mr. Brooks, you may proceed." Brooks rose, adjusting his tie. He was young, but he had fire in his eyes. He turned to the jury, scanning their faces, as if searching for any sliver of doubt, anyone willing to consider that this story might have another side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "what you just heard was a compelling narrative. Officer Walker has served the force for years, and he wears his badge with pride. But let's not forget something critical: not all heroes tell the truth." Walker's eyes narrowed. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Angela Carter, a woman with no prior criminal record, no history of violence, suddenly became a threat to public safety." Brooks paced in front of the jury. "They want you to believe that an officer, who should be trained in de-escalation, had no choice but to use force." He stopped and looked directly at Walker. "But here's the question they don't want you to ask: what if the officer isn't telling the whole story?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Brooks turned back to the jury. "You are about to hear a different version of that night. One that the prosecution doesn't want you to believe. One that challenges everything you think you know about this case." He nodded toward Angela. "And when you hear the truth, I promise you, you'll realize. Angela Carter is not the criminal in this courtroom." A murmur rippled through the audience. The judge banged his gavel. "Order," he demanded. "Let's proceed." Angela's heart pounded. This was just the beginning. A shadow of doubt, cracks in the story. The courtroom remained tense as Daniel Brooks took his seat beside Angela Carter. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit he had yet to break. Angela, in contrast, sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. He leaned toward her. "You okay?" Angela's lips barely moved. "I've been through worse." That response sent a ripple of curiosity through Brooks's mind, but he didn't press. "Not yet." Across the room, Officer Ryan Walker sat with his arms crossed, his expression unwavering. The jury had been watching him carefully, studying his every move, trying to gauge the man behind the badge. But Walker had been on the stand before. He knew how to keep his mask in place. The prosecution's first witness was called, a forensics officer, who presented photographs of Walker's uniform the night of the alleged altercation. The images showed a scuff on his sleeve and a barely noticeable red mark on his wrist. This mark, Sinclair said, gesturing toward the evidence, is consistent with a struggle. Angela didn't flinch. Brooks stood. Cross-examination, Your Honor? Judge Henderson nodded. Brooks approached the witness stand. Officer, is there any definitive proof that the red mark on Officer Walker's wrist was caused by my client? The forensics officer hesitated. Well, there's no way to determine exactly how. So, you can't say for certain that this was caused by Angela Carter, correct? Brooks pressed. The officer sighed. No. Brooks turned to the jury. Interesting. Because the prosecution seems quite confident about it. Sinclair objected, but the damage had already been done. Walker, however, remained unfazed. He wasn't worried about a scratch on his wrist. His story was airtight. Or so he thought. Then came the first real crack. Sinclair called Walker to the stand. He moved with the confidence of a man who had been in control his entire life. He adjusted the microphone, clearing his throat, then met the eyes of the jury. Officer Walker, Sinclair began, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that night? Walker nodded, his voice firm. I was responding to a disturbance call near a closed business. When I arrived, I saw the defendant standing outside the building, acting suspiciously. Brooks's eyebrows shot up slightly. That was new. Define suspicious, he muttered under his breath. Angela remained quiet. Watching. I approached and asked for identification, Walker continued, his tone even. But the defendant became aggressive. She raised her voice, refused to comply, and Walker hesitated. That pause was everything. Brooks caught it. The jury caught it. Angela? She was waiting for it. And then what? Sinclair prompted. Walker exhaled. She lunged at me, striking me in the chest and attempting to reach for my weapon. Brooks scribbled something on his notepad, lunged. First time he's said that. Sinclair continued, guiding Walker through his rehearsed testimony. Walker stuck to his story, never faltering, but that hesitation. That one fraction of a second, it was enough. Brooks stood. Cross-examination, Your Honor? Judge Henderson waved him forward. Brooks took a slow, deliberate pace toward the witness stand. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make Walker uncomfortable before speaking. Officer Walker, Brooks said casually, you testified that you were responding to a disturbance call, correct? Yes. And this call, was it about Angela Carter specifically? Did someone call the police and say, hey, I see a black woman on the sidewalk, send backup? A chuckle rippled through the spectators. Judge Henderson banged his gavel. Stay on track, Mr. Brooks. Brooks nodded. Apologies, Your Honor. Let me rephrase. Was there actually a report of a crime being committed that night? Walker's jaw tightened. The business was closed. She was standing outside it. That's considered suspicious. Says who? Brooks tilted his head. Standing on a sidewalk isn't a crime, is it? Walker shifted slightly in his seat. No, but you assumed she was a criminal? Sinclair objected. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge ruled. Brooks pivoted. Let's move on. You said Angela Carter lunged at you. Yes. You're certain? Walker hesitated again. Yes. That's funny, Brooks said, flipping through his notes, because in your original police report, you didn't use the word lunged. You said she was verbally aggressive. Walker's face tensed. So, which is it? Brooks pressed. Did she lunge, or was she just verbally aggressive? Walker forced a neutral expression. I was summarizing in my report. Summarizing? Brooks raised an eyebrow. You expect us to believe that you forgot to mention that a woman lunged at you and tried to grab your gun? That's a pretty big detail to leave out. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Sinclair shifted uncomfortably. Judge Henderson studied Walker carefully. The crack was growing wider. Brooks took a step closer. One last question, Officer Walker. His voice was quieter now, sharper. If Angela Carter was truly aggressive, if she was such a threat, why is it that your body camera conveniently malfunctioned that night? Walker's jaw clenched. I don't know, he said. Brooks let the silence settle. Then, he turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard it from the officer himself. No evidence. No video. No proof. Just his word. But ask yourselves this, is his word really enough? Walker swallowed hard. Angela Carter, for the first time that day, smiled. The game had begun. The war begins, battle in the courtroom. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. Before, Officer Ryan Walker had been the picture of confidence, a decorated police officer whose testimony was supposed to be unshakable. Now? A sliver of doubt had crept into the minds of the jury. Angela Carter had said nothing yet, her silence was her greatest weapon. But her lawyer, Daniel Brooks, had just cracked Walker's flawless testimony. And when you crack a liar's story, the whole thing starts to crumble. But Walker wasn't done yet. And neither was the prosecution. The prosecution strikes back. District Attorney David Sinclair, a man who had built his career on conviction rates, knew he was losing control of the narrative. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the jury with his signature "trust me" expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but firm, "the defense wants you to question Officer Walker's credibility. They want you to believe that an officer, who has spent over a decade protecting this city, would lie under oath." He turned, looking at the jury members one by one. "Does that make sense to you?" A few jurors glanced at one another. Sinclair continued, "Let's not lose sight of the facts here. Officer Walker has no history of misconduct. No formal complaints. He has risked his life for this community." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Now, compare that to the defendant." He gestured to Angela without looking at her. "We still don't know much about Ms. Carter, do we?" Angela tilted her head slightly, but said nothing. Sinclair turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would like to enter the defendant's employment records into evidence." Brooks immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor, relevance?" Sinclair smirked. "It goes directly to her character." Judge Henderson rubbed his chin. "Proceed cautiously, Mr. Sinclair." Sinclair walked to the evidence table, picked up a folder, and slowly opened it, like a magician revealing a trick. "Ms. Carter," he said smoothly, "you have no listed employment history in the past 5 years. Can you explain that?" The jury shifted uncomfortably. Angela remained composed. "I don't have to explain anything to you." A flicker of irritation crossed Sinclair's face, but he quickly recovered. "You're right, Ms. Carter. You don't. But the jury might find it odd that a woman with no job history, no financial records, and no public footprint happened to be involved in a violent altercation with a police officer." Brooks gritted his teeth. He could feel Sinclair setting a trap. Sinclair leaned in. "Tell me, Ms. Carter. What exactly do you do?" Angela didn't blink. "I live my life." A few jurors exchanged glances. Sinclair smiled as if he had won something. "Fascinating," he said, turning back toward the jury. "A woman with no job, no income, no clear past, who just so happened to end up arrested for attacking an officer." He let his words linger. Then, he turned to Judge Henderson. "No further questions. Brooks makes his move." Brooks stood immediately. "Cross-examination, Your Honor?" Judge Henderson nodded. Brooks approached the stand, his mind racing. He had to be careful. Sinclair was trying to make Angela look like a ghost, someone with a past so mysterious that she couldn't be trusted. He turned to Walker first. "Officer Walker, just to clarify. You arrested Ms. Carter that night because you believed she was dangerous, correct?" Walker nodded. "Yes. And yet," Brooks said, "you admitted in your own police report that she never actually threatened you." Walker hesitated. "She was non-compliant." Brooks nodded. "Right. And just so the jury understands, is being non-compliant a crime?" Walker shifted in his seat. "It depends on the circumstances." Brooks smirked. "So? No?" Walker clenched his jaw. "No." Sinclair objected. "Argumentative." Judge Henderson sighed. "Move on. Mr. Brooks." Brooks turned, hands in his pockets, pacing slightly. "Officer Walker, earlier you hesitated when I asked about Ms. Carter's alleged attack. Now, you hesitated again when I asked if non-compliance was a crime." He stopped and stared at the officer. "Tell me. Are you having trouble remembering the truth?" Walker's jaw twitched. "I know what I saw." Brooks turned to the jury. "So did the person who recorded the video." Walker tensed. The tension in the room spiked. "The video revelation." Brooks turned to Judge Henderson. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present video evidence taken by a bystander during the arrest." Sinclair stood. "Objection. The prosecution was not made aware of this evidence." Judge Henderson sighed. "Mr. Brooks, if you have something substantial, show it. But be quick." Brooks handed the USB drive to the bailiff. The room went silent. The screen flickered. And then, there it was. A grainy cell phone video, shaky at first, but clear enough to show Walker standing in front of Angela, gripping her wrist. And then, his voice. "Women like you don't get to question me." A collective gasp erupted in the courtroom. Walker's face drained of color. The jury's expressions shifted: anger, shock, disbelief. Judge Henderson immediately banged his gavel. "Order. I want order in this courtroom." But the damage had been done. Angela Carter finally looked at Walker. And for the first time, he wouldn't look back. The aftermath. The trial went into recess, but the courtroom buzzed with energy. Reporters rushed to send updates. Spectators whispered. Walker's fellow officers sat in the back, their expressions less certain than before. Angela turned to Brooks. "That wasn't even the biggest piece of evidence," she murmured. Brooks blinked. "Wait, what?" Angela exhaled. "There's more." Sinclair, overhearing this, froze. Walker, still seated at the stand, clenched his fists. Judge Henderson called the court back into session. And everyone knew, this trial had just changed forever. The tide turns, a case built on lies. The courtroom was electrified. The shaky cell phone footage had shattered the carefully constructed image of Officer Ryan Walker as an upstanding lawman. His words, "Women like you don't get to question me," hung in the air like a curse, impossible to ignore. The jury had felt it. The spectators had felt it. And most importantly, Walker had felt it. But the fight wasn't over. Not even close. As Judge Henderson banged his gavel, calling for order, District Attorney David Sinclair was already moving. He knew the case had taken a severe blow, but he wasn't about to let it collapse entirely. "This video," Sinclair said, his voice steady despite the growing storm around him, "proves nothing." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Sinclair turned to the jury, ever the composed strategist. "We don't see what happened before the footage began. We don't see Ms. Carter's actions leading up to this moment." Brooks narrowed his eyes. Sinclair faced the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution contends that this video is out of context and should not be used as definitive evidence against Officer Walker." Brooks immediately stood. "Objection. The footage clearly shows." Judge Henderson held up a hand. His gaze was hard. "Mr. Sinclair, I will allow you to argue your case," he said. Then, turning to Brooks, he added, "But this video is very much in play." Brooks hid a smirk. Walker, however, sat stiffly at the prosecution's table. His face was pale. His hands clenched. He had counted on his authority, on his uniform, on his history of being believed without question. Now, that belief was crumbling. Brooks goes in for the kill. Brooks adjusted his jacket, exhaling sharply. "Your Honor, the defense calls Angela Carter to the stand." A wave of whispers shot through the room. This was it. The moment she would finally speak. Angela rose, moving with slow, deliberate steps toward the witness stand. Walker didn't look at her. But she looked directly at him. Once sworn in, she settled into her seat, hands folded neatly on her lap. She radiated calm control, the kind that made the jury lean in, hungry for answers. Brooks stepped forward. "Ms. Carter, let's start with the obvious. Did you attack Officer Walker that night?" Angela's gaze didn't waver. "No." A hush fell over the courtroom. Brooks nodded. "Walk us through that night. In your own words." Angela took a slow breath. "I was walking home after visiting a friend," she began. "I stopped to check my phone for directions. That's when Officer Walker approached me." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Did he explain why he stopped you?" Angela's jaw tightened. "No." Brooks turned to the jury. "He didn't tell you why he was questioning you?" "No." Brooks pivoted. "What happened next?" Angela's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the stand. "He asked for my ID. I asked why. He told me, and I quote, 'Because I said so.'" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Brooks let it settle before speaking again. "At any point, did you threaten him?" "No." "Did you lunge at him?" Angela's voice was icy calm. "No." Brooks approached the jury box, turning slightly so they could see Angela as she spoke. "What did happen?" Angela's dark eyes locked onto Walker. "He grabbed my arm." The silence was deafening. Brooks's voice dropped lower. "He grabbed you?" "Yes." "And what did you do?" Angela exhaled sharply. "I told him to let go." "He didn't." Instead, he tightened his grip and said, "Women like you need to learn how to listen." Judge Henderson tapped his gavel once, but it was almost a reflex. He, too, was staring at Walker now. Brooks let that statement hang before speaking again. "And after that?" Angela sat a little straighter. "I pulled back, not aggressively, just trying to free my arm. That's when he slammed me against the squad car." More whispers. Brooks let the jury absorb her words before stepping toward the prosecution's table. "Mr. Sinclair, I have a question for you." Sinclair stiffened. "This is highly unorthodox." Brooks waved a hand. "Just humor me. If a man, let's say not a cop, grabs a woman, refuses to let go, and then forces her against a car, what would you call that?" Sinclair froze. The jury leaned in. Brooks tilted his head. "Because I'd call it assault." The room exploded into murmurs. Angela, still composed, turned her attention back to Walker. For the first time since the trial began. Walker looked away first. Sinclair fights back. Sinclair scrambled to recover. "Objection, this is a distortion of the facts," he snapped. Judge Henderson sighed. "Sustained." "Mr. Brooks, stick to the testimony." Brooks nodded, then shifted gears. "Ms. Carter," he said, "let's talk about your background." Angela's expression remained neutral. Brooks took a step closer. "Mr. Sinclair implied that you have no job history, no official record of employment. Is that true?" Angela exhaled. "No." Sinclair froze. Brooks nodded encouragingly. "Tell the court exactly what you did for work." Angela straightened in her seat. "I served in the United States Navy." A gasp ran through the gallery. Brooks didn't stop. "And what was your position?" Angela's voice was clear. "I was a lieutenant commander." The jury's eyes widened. Brooks took a slow breath. "And what was your specialty?" Angela stared at Walker. "I was a SEAL." Sinclair visibly paled. The room erupted. Judge Henderson slammed his gavel. "Order. Order in the court." But the damage had been done. Angela Carter, the woman Walker had accused of being a threat, was a highly trained, elite military operative. She hadn't just served. She had fought for this country. Sinclair scrambled to respond, but Brooks wasn't done yet. "So," Brooks said, pacing slowly. "To be clear, you're a woman trained to handle the most extreme, high-pressure situations on the planet. Trained to keep control under fire. And yet, we're supposed to believe that you lost your temper over being questioned on a sidewalk?" Angela tilted her head slightly. "I don't lose my temper, Mr. Brooks." The jury hung on her every word. "I don't lunge at people. I don't lose control." She turned back to Walker. "But I do know how to recognize fear when I see it." Walker's face was ashen. Brooks turned to the jury, his voice like steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, who do you believe? The fall of a liar, the truth explodes." The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It was a battlefield. And at the center of it stood Angela Carter, a former lieutenant commander, a Navy SEAL, a decorated soldier who had spent 20 years facing down real enemies. And now, she was staring down Officer Ryan Walker. He looked nothing like the confident, unshakable officer who had walked into the courtroom that morning. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced with something more raw, more telling. Fear. The jury could see it. The audience could see it. And Angela? She had seen it from the beginning. Walker's collapse begins. Judge Henderson's gavel slammed down. "Order in the court." The murmurs slowly died, but the energy in the room didn't fade. District Attorney David Sinclair was sweating through his expensive suit. His case, once a surefire conviction, was slipping through his fingers. And Angela's calm, calculated revelation had pushed it to the edge of collapse. Sinclair tried to pivot, regaining control. "Ms. Carter," he said, forcing confidence into his tone, "you claim you're a decorated Navy SEAL. But the jury hasn't seen any official documentation of your service." Angela simply nodded. "You're right." Sinclair blinked. I am?" Angela turned to her lawyer. "Mr. Brooks?" Brooks was already reaching into his briefcase. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the defense submits official military records confirming Angela Carter's service as a United States Navy SEAL and her rank of lieutenant commander." A heavy folder was handed to the bailiff. Sinclair's face blanched. Judge Henderson scanned the contents, then turned to Sinclair with a cold stare. "The court recognizes Ms. Carter's military service." Sinclair clenched his jaw, barely hiding his frustration. Angela watched him squirm. Then she leaned forward, her voice steady. "And yet, even without the records, you believed Officer Walker's testimony without question." Sinclair's mouth opened, but no words came out. Angela didn't break eye contact. "I wonder why that is." The implication hung in the air. Sinclair knew what she meant. The jury knew what she meant. And most importantly, Ryan Walker knew what she meant. The video that changes everything. Brooks stepped forward, his voice sharper than before. "Your Honor, the defense has additional evidence." Sinclair whipped his head around. "Objection. This was not submitted." Judge Henderson cut him off. "Overruled." Sinclair fumed. Brooks handed another USB to the bailiff. The courtroom screen flickered to life. New footage. Not from a bystander. Not from a civilian. From a security camera across the street from the arrest site. Walker's face drained of color. The video played. Angela standing still. Checking her phone. Walker approaching her. Aggressive stance. Hand already on his weapon. The jury leaned forward. Angela asking a question. Calmly. Clearly. Walker shoving her. Gripping her arm. Twisting it behind her back. Then came the worst part. The audio was pristine. You people never know when to shut up. The courtroom exploded. Gasps. Outrage. Murmurs of disbelief. Even Judge Henderson looked momentarily stunned before slamming his gavel. Brooks let it sink in. Then, his final move. He paused the video and pointed at the screen. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, Officer Walker lied. He lied under oath. And not only did he lie, he targeted my client from the moment he saw her. Walker's hands clenched into fists. Brooks turned to him, voice razor sharp. Tell me, Officer Walker. Was your body camera malfunctioning then? Walker said nothing. He couldn't. Because the truth had spoken louder than his lies ever could. The final attack, Walker unravels. Sinclair stood abruptly. Your Honor, I. Brooks held up a hand. No. He speaks now. His words weren't a question. They were a command. Walker finally lifted his gaze. Angela was waiting for him. Brooks took a step closer. Tell us, Officer Walker. Why did you really stop Angela Carter that night? Walker swallowed hard. Sinclair tried to intervene. My client doesn't have to. Walker snapped. She was acting suspicious. The courtroom reacted instantly. Brooks pounced. Suspicious how? Walker's voice cracked. She. He was crumbling. Angela tilted her head. Brooks pressed harder. Or was it just that she was a black woman standing on a sidewalk? Walker's face twisted. He had nowhere left to go. Nowhere left to run. Judge Henderson's voice was like a hammer. Officer Walker, he said, I suggest you retain legal counsel. Immediately. Walker froze. Then the reality crashed down on him. The trial wasn't about Angela Carter anymore. It was about him. Sinclair looked away. He wasn't going to save him. The jury saw it now. Walker had lied. He had abused his power. And now, he would face the consequences. The aftermath, the end of an empire. As the jury left to deliberate, Angela finally exhaled. Brooks turned to her. That was incredible. She shook her head. That was necessary. Walker sat motionless, his entire world shattering around him. Sinclair was already on damage control, whispering to his assistants. And Angela? She finally looked away from Walker, because he was no longer worth her attention. She had spent her entire life fighting battles overseas. Now, she had just won the most important war of her life. But the fight wasn't over yet. The verdict was coming. And justice was about to be served. The verdict, justice on trial. The courtroom was thick with anticipation. The jury had been sent to deliberate, but no one was leaving. Not the reporters, not the spectators, not even the officers in the back row who had once stood in silent solidarity with Officer Ryan Walker. Now, some of them weren't even looking at him. Angela Carter sat calm, unmoving, her face unreadable as she stared straight ahead. Her entire life had been built on high-stakes situations, but even she could feel it, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Walker, on the other hand, his world was crumbling. He was no longer a man in uniform. He was no longer an officer whose words were taken as truth without question. Now, he was just another disgraced man waiting for his fate. Sinclair had abandoned him. The prosecution had nothing left. And the jury had seen everything. The jury returns, and a surprise move. An hour later, the door creaked open. The jury had returned. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the 12 men and women filed back into their seats. The bailiff took his place, his voice steady despite the tension. The jury has reached a verdict. Angela exhaled slowly. Walker's fingers clenched into the fabric of his pants. Judge Henderson nodded. Proceed. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an unreadable expression, stood. In the case of State v. Angela Carter, we, the jury, find the defendant. The room held its breath. Not guilty on all charges. A wave of emotion crashed over the room. Gasps. A few muffled cheers before the judge's gavel slammed down. Walker flinched at the sound. Angela remained still. She had known the truth would prevail. She had known that a jury, when faced with undeniable facts, would see through the lies. Still, hearing the words, it was a victory she had fought too long to ignore. Judge Henderson turned to her. "Ms. Carter, you are free to go." Brooks let out a slow, satisfied breath. He turned to Angela, expecting a reaction. A smile. A sigh of relief. Something. But all she did was nod. It wasn't about celebration. It was about justice. The final blow, Walker's reckoning. But the trial wasn't over. Not for Walker. The forewoman wasn't done speaking. Furthermore, she continued, her voice steady, "We, the jury, strongly recommend that an internal investigation be opened against Officer Ryan Walker for perjury and misconduct." Walker's entire body stiffened. The room erupted. The officers in the back exchanged glances. Angela turned slowly, meeting Walker's eyes one last time. She had faced worse men than him. She had faced actual threats. And yet, men like Walker, the ones who wore power like armor, thinking they could never be touched, were the most dangerous of all. Walker's lawyer, who had been silent the entire time, paled. Judge Henderson's face was stone. "Officer Walker." Walker swallowed hard. "You are now under formal investigation," the judge continued. "I suggest you retain legal counsel." It was over. The walls he had built around himself had finally collapsed. Angela Carter didn't need to say another word. Because the truth had already spoken for her. Outside the courthouse, a message to the world. The second Angela stepped outside, the press swarmed. Microphone shoved toward her. Cameras flashing. Reporters screaming her name. But she didn't flinch. She was used to war zones. She had lived through fire. This was just another battle won. Brooks stood beside her, watching as she faced the crowd. "What do you want to say to the public, Ms. Carter?" one reporter asked. Angela took her time. She let the noise settle before speaking, and when she did, her voice was calm, unwavering. "This was never just about me," she said. A hush fell over the crowd. "This was about accountability. About power. About the kind of men who think their badges make them untouchable." She paused, scanning the sea of faces. "But more than anything, this was about the truth." She stepped forward, her presence commanding even without a uniform. "I fought for this country," she said, her voice strong. "I fought for justice. And I will keep fighting. Because no one, not even a man with a badge, is above the law." The applause started slowly. Then it grew. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering. Because Angela Carter wasn't just a woman who won a case. She was a symbol. A symbol that the system didn't always win. That liars didn't always go unpunished. That the truth could still, sometimes, prevail. Brooks turned to her. "You just made history," he murmured. Angela shook her head. "No," she said. "I just reminded them that history is still being written." And with that, she walked away. But the story wasn't over yet. Not for Walker. Not for men like him. Because justice had just begun. The unexpected twist: justice is never that simple. Angela Carter should have been celebrating. She should have walked away from that courthouse a free woman, leaving Ryan Walker to face his own reckoning. But justice? Justice was never that simple, and the system never let go of its own without a fight. The attack in the parking lot. The courthouse steps were swarming with press, the flashing lights blinding, the voices of reporters blending into static noise. Angela didn't flinch. She had survived worse. But as she made her way toward the courthouse parking lot, she felt it. A presence. A weight in the air that didn't belong. Brooks was a few steps behind her, fielding a call. The press had stayed back. The cops who once stood in Walker's corner had scattered like cockroaches. But someone was still there. Watching. Angela kept walking. She reached her car, keys in hand, then, a shadow moved behind her. Too fast. Too close. Instinct kicked in. She spun, just as a figure lunged at her. A man. A uniform. A cop. Ambushed. Pain exploded in her ribs. The punch landed hard, but Angela absorbed the impact, twisting with the momentum. Another figure moved from the shadows, two of them. She caught a glimpse. Badges. They weren't here to arrest her. They were here to send a message. "You think you won?" one of them growled. Angela barely had time to block the next hit. But this time, she wasn't just defending herself. She was fighting back. The seal wakes up. Her elbow shot up, connecting with the first man's jaw. A sickening crack echoed as he staggered back. The second man drew his baton. Swinging. Angela ducked and drove her knee into his gut, sending him reeling. But the first officer wasn't down. He yanked out his gun. The muzzle gleamed in the parking lot lights. Angela froze. Not because she was afraid. Because she recognized him. Officer Bradley Quinn. Walker's former partner. The man who had sat silently in the back row of the courtroom. Watching. Waiting. You humiliated him, Quinn spat, breathing heavily. You humiliated all of us. Angela's jaw clenched. You did that to yourselves, she said coldly. Quinn's finger twitched on the trigger. Then, freeze. Drop the weapon. The shout split the air, followed by the sudden click of safeties being released. Angela glanced past Quinn's shoulder. Half a dozen officers were now standing in the lot, guns raised, and at the front of them, Detective Marcus Hayes, one of the few honest cops left in the city. The betrayal within the force. Quinn's face drained of color. He knew. He was caught. Drop it, Hayes repeated, his voice like steel. For a moment, Angela thought Quinn might try his luck, but then, with a shaky breath, he let the gun fall to the pavement. The moment it hit the ground, the other officers moved in, cuffing him and his partner. Quinn's eyes burned into Angela. This isn't over, he snarled. Angela stepped closer, her voice low, sharp, lethal. Oh, it is for you. Hayes stepped forward. Carter, are you hurt? Angela exhaled slowly, shaking out her bruised wrist. Nothing I can't handle. Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded. Then he turned to Quinn. You and your little buddy are gonna burn for this. Quinn spat blood onto the pavement. You really think the department's gonna turn on us? Hayes didn't flinch. I don't think, Quinn. I know. And just like that, the second cop fell. The system strikes back. But Angela knew the truth. It wouldn't stop here. Walker was just one symptom of a bigger disease. Men like him didn't operate alone. And the system never let its monsters fall without a fight. As Quinn was dragged toward a squad car, Brooks finally caught up. What the hell just happened? He demanded. Angela turned toward him, her body still thrumming with adrenaline. She should have been rattled. She should have been shaken. Instead, she was focused. This wasn't just about Walker, she murmured. Brooks frowned. What are you saying? Angela's gaze hardened. I'm saying, I don't think this is over. Brooks stared at her, and for the first time since he'd met Angela Carter, he wasn't sure if they'd won it all. The war isn't over. The system fights back. The attack in the parking lot should have been the end of it. It should have been the final move, a desperate, failed attempt by a few dirty cops to silence Angela Carter before she walked away completely vindicated. But Angela had spent too many years in war zones to believe in simple endings. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. The aftermath, an ugly truth revealed. The next morning, headlines exploded across every news station. Police officers arrested for attempted assault on Navy SEAL after trial. Racial bias, corruption at the heart of Walker case. How deep does it go? Ex-cop Ryan Walker under investigation for perjury, misconduct. But behind the cameras, Angela was already back in battle mode. She sat across from Detective Marcus Hayes in a dimly lit office, staring at a thick folder full of reports. Angela had asked for them. Hayes had hesitated, but after what had happened in the parking lot, he knew she needed to see the truth for herself. And what she found? It was worse than she imagined. A pattern of abuse, and a cover-up. Walker wasn't an isolated case. Neither was Quinn. This was bigger. There were complaints, hidden reports, witness statements that had been buried. Multiple officers. Multiple cases of excessive force, abuse of power, racial profiling. And every time? It was covered up. How long? Angela asked, her voice dangerously calm. Hayes exhaled. Years. Angela turned a page. Another name. Another victim. A black teenager arrested on false charges. A Hispanic man beaten in an alleyway, no disciplinary action taken. An innocent woman killed in custody, case closed without an investigation. Angela's fingers tightened on the folder. This wasn't just about her. This was about all of them. The decision, go public or stay silent? Brooks sat across from her, watching her closely. You don't owe anyone anything, he said carefully. You could walk away, Angela. The case is over. You're free. Angela met his gaze. Am I? Brooks hesitated. Legally? Yes. But if you do this, if you take this fight public, they'll come after me, she finished for him. Brooks didn't deny it. Hayes sighed. Angela? This isn't a fight you can win alone. Angela leaned back, thinking. Then, she looked at Brooks. Who says I'm alone? Brooks blinked. You're serious? She nodded. I didn't come this far to watch this happen to someone else. She turned to Hayes. I want every file, every report they tried to hide, she said. And I want names. Hayes rubbed his face. Jesus, Carter. You're about to make a lot of enemies. Angela's smile was razor sharp. I've had worse. The war begins, a message to the system. That night, Angela sat in a news studio, facing the camera. This time, she wasn't the defendant. She wasn't the victim. She was the one calling the shots. The interviewer cleared her throat, glancing at her notes before meeting Angela's gaze. "Ms. Carter, you have the country's attention. What do you want to say?" Angela didn't hesitate. "I want to talk about the people the system tried to erase," she said. "I want to talk about the cases they buried. The lives they destroyed. The people they thought no one would fight for." She leaned forward. "I'm here to fight for them." The interviewer swallowed. "And what do you say to the police department? To the officers who are watching this right now?" Angela's expression hardened. "If you're one of the good ones, then prove it," she said. "Stand up. Speak out. Fix your house. And if you're one of the bad ones?" Angela's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Then you should be afraid." The interview aired the next morning. It went viral in an hour. By noon, multiple internal investigations had been announced. By the end of the week, officers were resigning. By the end of the month, Ryan Walker was indicted for perjury. And Angela Carter? She had become something more than a defendant. She had become a reckoning. The final moment, a choice left open. One evening, Brooks found Angela standing at the edge of a rooftop, looking out at the city. "You did it," he said. Angela exhaled. "I started it." Brooks shoved his hands in his pockets. "So what now?" Angela didn't answer immediately. For the first time in years, she had a choice. She could disappear. Live a quiet life, free of war, of battles, of enemies. Or, she could keep fighting. She turned to Brooks, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "You ever wonder what happens when a SEAL goes after the enemy they never expected?" Brooks's eyebrows lifted. "Are we talking about terrorists or corrupt cops?" Angela's smile widened. "Does it matter?" Brooks sighed. "Jesus. You're never gonna let this go, are you?" Angela turned back to the city, wind brushing against her face. "No," she said simply. "Because the war isn't over." And with that, she walked away. Where? No one knew. But one thing was certain. Angela Carter wasn't done yet. And neither was justice. Real-world lessons from Angela Carter's story. Angela Carter's story isn't just a courtroom drama, it's a reflection of real struggles happening today. It highlights systemic corruption, abuse of power, and the importance of standing up for truth even when the odds are stacked against you. One of the biggest lessons? Silence enables injustice. Walker and his fellow officers thrived on a system that protected them, until someone challenged it. Corruption doesn't collapse on its own, it crumbles when people demand accountability. Another key takeaway? Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's taking action despite it. Angela had every reason to walk away after her trial, but she knew the fight wasn't just about her. She chose to expose the truth so others wouldn't have to suffer the same fate. So what can we do? Educate yourself. Question authority when necessary. Support those fighting for justice. Speak out when you see wrongdoing. The system is only as strong as the people willing to hold it accountable. And like Angela, we all have a choice: stay silent or make a difference. Because justice isn't just a courtroom victory. It's a battle we fight every day.